Imagine being 15 years old, trapped in a house where silence is deadlier than any scream. Your brother breaks you, and your mother, the one person meant to protect you, stands in the doorway and does nothing. He watches. He turns away. For decades, I carried that silence like a coffin strapped to my back, until the day I forced her to speak. This isn't just a story of betrayal. This is the story of how I shattered the silence that nearly killed me, and exposed the truth in the very place it was buried. My name is Margaret Lawson, though most people call me Maggie now. I am 79 years old, and if you were to look at me sitting here in my faded armchair with a knitted blanket draped across my lap, you'd think I was nothing more than a gentle old woman waiting out her days in peace. But peace has never been a gift given to me. Not when I was a child. Not when I became a woman. And not even now, when the memories come rushing back like ghosts the moment the sun begins to sink. I learned the meaning of betrayal long before I should have. I learned that the deepest cuts don't come from strangers but from the people who share your blood, your name, your home. I was 15 years old when everything changed. It was late autumn, the kind of day when the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the trees stood half-naked against a bruised sky. My father had already left for his shift at the mill. My younger sister, Ruth, was at a friend's house. That left me alone with my brother, Daniel, and my mother, Helen. I can still hear the sound of Daniel's footsteps that day. Slow, deliberate, heavy on the worn wood of the hallway floor. He was 20 years old, taller than me by a head, and stronger in the way boys are when their voices crack and their bodies stretch overnight. His shadow filled the doorway of my room before he did. "Maggie," he said. His voice carried that tone I'd come to dread, the one that made my stomach twist and my throat go dry. I shook my head before he even stepped inside. "Please, Daniel, not today." But he didn't listen. He never did. He crossed the room, grabbed my wrist, and shoved me back onto the bed. My body was small, light. I had no chance against his weight. My cries filled the air, muffled by his hand. And that's when I saw her, my mother, standing in the doorway. She wasn't rushing to stop him. She wasn't shouting, wasn't pleading, wasn't even moving. She just stood there, her hands gripping the frame so tightly I thought her knuckles might crack. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow. "Mom," I sobbed. "Please, please help me." But she did nothing. Nothing. The room smelled of dust and iron from the radiator. My own tears blurred my vision, but I will never forget her expression. It wasn't shock. It wasn't confusion. It was something colder. Something like resignation. As if she had decided long ago that silence was easier than saving me. The minutes stretched like hours. When it was over, I curled against the wall, shaking, broken. Daniel smirked as he left, his footsteps fading down the hall. His victory sealed by my mother's silence. And she turned away. She didn't come to me. She didn't hold me. She didn't say a single word. That was the day everything changed. It wasn't the first time Daniel hurt me, but it was the day I realized I was utterly alone in that house. My brother was my tormentor, but my mother was the accomplice. I remember sinking to the floor, my nails digging into the rug until my fingers ached. My body throbbed with pain, but it was the silence that carved deepest. Silence from the one person who was supposed to protect me. I whispered to myself over and over, "She saw. I thought maybe she would come to me later. Maybe she would knock on my door once Daniel was asleep. Maybe she would whisper an apology, explain why she hadn't moved, why she had frozen in place." But the hours passed. The house grew dark, and no knock came. Instead, I heard her voice downstairs, calm and steady, asking Daniel if he wanted more stew. As if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't begged her with every ounce of my soul to save me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the cracks in the plaster forming patterns like jagged roads. And I made myself a promise. A promise that became the thread of my entire life. One day she would speak. One day, the silence she clung to like armor would be ripped away. One day, her voice would be forced into the light. But at 15 years old, all I had were the whispers of that vow and the ache in my bones. The days that followed blurred together. At school, I wore long sleeves, even when the classroom was warm, to hide the bruises. My teachers asked nothing. My classmates noticed nothing, or if they did, they chose to ignore it the way my mother had. At night, I slept with my door locked, though it never stopped Daniel from finding ways in. Sometimes I would hear the creak of the floorboards outside my room, and I would curl into myself, clutching a pillow, praying he would keep walking. And always, my mother remained silent. Sometimes she would pass me in the hallway, her eyes brushing mine for the briefest second before sliding away. Sometimes I would hear her humming in the kitchen, her voice calm, steady, betraying nothing of the storm she knew brewed inside our walls. It was worse than hatred, worse than cruelty. It was abandonment. The memory of that day, her standing there watching, doing nothing, burned itself into me like a brand. Changed how I saw her. Changed how I saw myself. I was no longer just a daughter. I was a witness to her betrayal. And deep down, even then, I knew the silence would not hold forever. Secrets never do. But back then I was still a child. I didn't have the strength, the power, the voice to fight back. Not yet. So I endured. I endured because I had no choice. Because in that house, silence was the law, and speaking was a crime punishable by disbelief and shame. I endured. But I never forgot. The memory of that day haunted me in the quiet moments. When the wind rattled the windows. When the church bells tolled on Sunday morning. When I saw other mothers clasp their daughters' hands with warmth and love. It whispered to me in the dark, "One day you will make her speak." That day, the day I looked into her eyes as she stood in the doorway and did nothing, that was the day everything changed. The day a part of me died and another part was born. A part forged from betrayal and silence. A part that would grow sharper, harder, with each passing year. But even as I swore it, I could never have imagined how long it would take. How much I would have to lose. How deep the silence would run before it finally shattered. And when it did shatter, it wouldn't just break her. It would break us all. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. When people look back on their childhoods, they often speak of summer evenings chasing fireflies, birthday parties with candles glowing, the comfort of a mother's arms when nightmares came. My childhood had some of that too, at least on the surface. But when I peel back the layers, when I look closely at the seams of my memories, I see the cracks that had been there all along, the fractures that widened until everything split open. I grew up in Willow Bend, a quiet little town where everybody knew everybody else's business. On the outside, our family looked like the kind of picture you'd see on a church calendar. My father, Richard Lawson, worked long hours at the lumber mill. My mother, Helen, kept the house tidy, the laundry folded, the meals hot on the table every night at 6 sharp. My brother Daniel was the golden child, the eldest, the boy who carried our family name like a crown. And me. I was just Maggie, the second-born, the girl with braids down her back and a quiet voice that too often went unheard. Neighbors would say things like, "Helen Lawson has the perfect home," or, "Those Lawson kids are so well-behaved." They never saw the shadows inside. They never noticed how my mother's smile never quite reached her eyes. They never noticed how Daniel's hand lingered on my shoulder a little too long, or how my laughter dimmed when he entered a room. Looking back, I can see the warning signs. At the time, though, I thought they were just normal parts of life. Daniel had always been cruel in little ways. When we were younger, he would pinch me under the table at dinner, then flash an innocent grin when our parents glanced over. He'd hide my school books just before I needed them, watching me panic before handing them back with a smirk. If I told on him, my mother would sigh and tell me not to make trouble. "Boys will be boys, Maggie," she would say, her voice flat. "You're his sister. Learn to get along." But it wasn't getting along. It was survival. I learned early on that Daniel's moods dictated the rhythm of the household. If he was in a good mood, the evening passed peacefully. If he was angry, everyone walked on eggshells. My mother catered to him, my father bragged about him, and I shrank myself small so I wouldn't be noticed. There were nights when I'd sit on the porch steps, clutching my knees, listening to the crickets sing, and wonder why I felt so different from the other girls at school. They talked about their brothers like they were protectors, like they were playmates who teased but always defended them. My brother wasn't my protector. He was my shadow, and not the kind that disappears in the dark. And then there was my mother. Helen Lawson was a woman of silence. She moved through the house like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, folding laundry, but rarely speaking more than what was necessary. She had a way of making herself invisible, even when she was standing right in front of you. I used to think she was shy or tired, or just one of those women who held their feelings deep inside. But sometimes when I caught her alone, scrubbing dishes at the sink or folding sheets in the dim light of the laundry room, I'd see something flicker across her face. Shadow of fear. A whisper of guilt. As if she knew more than she would ever admit. And then, just as quickly, it would vanish, replaced by the same blank expression she wore like armor. It wasn't until I was older that I understood. My mother had chosen silence long before the day she stood in the doorway. Silence was her way of surviving. But to me it felt like abandonment. One memory stands out clearer than the rest. I was 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a scraped knee. Daniel had pushed me down in the yard after I beat him in a game of marbles. Blood trickled down my leg, and I cried, more from the humiliation than the pain. "Mom," I sobbed, "he hurt me." She glanced at me, then at Daniel, who was leaning against the doorframe with that smug grin plastered across his face. "Stop crying, Maggie," she said softly. "You'll be fine." And that was it. No scolding. No punishment. No defense. I remember staring at her, my mouth open in shock. I wanted her to take my side just once. But her eyes slid away, and I realized that in our house, Daniel's word always outweighed mine. That was the first crack. Over the years, more cracks appeared. My father worked longer hours, and when he came home, he cared little for what went on between his children. He sat at the head of the table, ate his supper, and read the paper while the rest of us orbited around him. Daniel grew bolder, testing boundaries, pushing limits. My mother grew quieter, her silences stretching longer. And me. I grew lonelier. I started keeping journals, writing down the things I couldn't say out loud. Page after page filled with my fears, my anger, my desperate hope that one day someone would believe me. I hid those journals under the loose floorboard beneath my bed, terrified Daniel would find them but unable to stop writing. Those journals became my only friends. The night terrors began around that time too. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced that Daniel was standing over me. My mother would appear in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hall light. For a moment, I'd think she was there to comfort me. But she never crossed the threshold. "Go back to sleep, Maggie," she'd whisper. And then she'd disappear, leaving me trembling in the dark. I began to realize that her silence wasn't just weakness. It was a choice. She was choosing not to see, not to act, not to protect. And that cut deeper than Daniel's cruelty ever could. Because cruelty I could understand. Cruelty had a logic. He was stronger, he was meaner, and he liked to hurt. But a mother's silence. That was a betrayal I couldn't wrap my head around. By the time I turned 12, I had already learned how to read the signs, the tightening of Daniel's jaw, the glint in his eyes when he was about to lash out. I had also learned that no matter how loudly I cried, no matter how desperately I begged, my mother would not stop him. That's why the day she stood in the doorway watching did not come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of cracks in the foundation. Years of her silence. Years of his cruelty. That was the day the cracks split wide open, swallowing everything I thought I knew about family. But even as I tell you this now, there's a part of me that still aches for the girl I was. The girl who kept hoping her mother would change, that one day Helen Lawson would look at me, really look at me, and finally speak. That hope lingered for years, fragile but stubborn, like a candle flickering in a draft. It lingered until the night Daniel's cruelty reached its peak. The night my body broke under the weight of his violence. The night I realized there was no hope left. That night was the lowest point of my life. And it was the night that set me on the path to revenge. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. I used to think the house creaked for everyone the same way it did for me. Years later I learned that wood remembers the weight it carries. It keeps a record of footsteps, of doors opened and closed, of what was said and what was swallowed. Our hallway boards complained the loudest at night, right where the runner rug frayed at the edge and the wallpaper lifted like a hangnail. Every sound traveled. Nothing stayed secret except the truth. It happened on a Wednesday. Supper was pot roast and carrots, the kind my mother favored whenever my father worked late. She liked meals that kept their shape in the pot, that could wait without falling apart if he bothered to come home early. He did not. After supper my mother stacked the plates and ran the tap until the water turned hot. I wiped the table, careful with the cloth, tracing circles until the wood shone. Daniel leaned in the doorway like a bad thought you cannot shake. When I turned to carry the dishwater to the sink, he moved just enough to make the room feel smaller. I asked my mother if she needed anything else. She did not answer. She dried her hands, folded the towel the way she always did, then set it on the counter. She stared at nothing. Or maybe she stared right at the thing I could not yet see. By the time the kitchen went quiet, the wind had started its low winter moan. I took my school books to my room and set them in a neat stack. It was almost a prayer, the way I lined my pencils and squared the corners of the paper. Order has a sound if you listen closely. It is softer than mercy, but it keeps you breathing. The hallway clock ticked. A drip inside the radiator kept pace. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped. I stood and shut my door. The latch was old and sometimes it failed. I tugged it twice to be sure. Failed. The first thing I felt was the cold air when the door swung in. The second thing I felt was the floor under my knees. There is a kind of violence that steals sound from your mouth. Not because you are brave, but because fear makes every muscle lock at once. I wanted to scream. Could not. The room tilted. My hands scrambled for anything to hold. The bedspring sang a thin metal note I can still hear today. I remember the taste of blood as if I had bitten my own tongue hard enough to make it swell, and the way the lamp glowed a sickly yellow under the shade. I remember most the doorway. My mother filled it. She leaned her shoulder against the frame, face pale, lips colorless. Her hands pressed flat to the wood as if the house itself might slide away if she let go. I said her name. A whisper first, then a plea. Helen. Please. She blinked. She blinked the way you blink when dust floats into your eye and scratches. Then not again. Her mouth parted, then closed. She lifted one hand as if to push a strand of hair behind her ear, but there was no hair loose. She had pinned it with care earlier that afternoon. Did not move now. I waited for her to say stop. I waited for a pot to crash, for the sound of a chair dragged across the floor, for anything loud enough to crack the moment. What I got was the slow click of the hallway clock and the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. When fear finally let go of my throat, the sound that came out of me was not a scream. It was smaller, a sound I had not made since I was a toddler learning how to ask to be held. Did not matter. The air swallowed it. Pain is strange. It sharpens some details and blurs others. The rosette carved into the bedpost looked so precise I could count each petal. The ceiling stain by the far corner had the shape of a map, a country with no name. The rug's woven edge cut into my knees. I felt the thread pattern as if it had been stitched into my skin. When it was over, the room did not rush back the way you might expect. Time did not return to normal. I was aware of the window first, of my breath fogging the glass with each shallow exhale. Then the smell of hot metal and dust. Then my hands trembling on the floorboards, the boards that remembered. I tried to stand and could not. I tried again, and the edge of the bed rose up like a cliff. I managed only to slide my back against the frame and sit. Every part of me argued. I thought if I stayed very still, the world would stop tilting. Daniel left without looking at me. The door banged against the jamb and stuck at a slant like a mouth held crooked by spite. He went down the hall, and each step thudded through the old wood as if he wanted the house to know exactly where he was. For a long moment there was nothing. Then my mother stepped into the room. I thought she might kneel. She did not. I thought she might hand me a glass of water. She did not. She looked at me the way people look at storms from a distance, accepting what they cannot change. Then she reached for the lamp and turned the knob as if lowering the light could shrink the harm. The glow dimmed until the shade held only a heartbeat of gold. She turned to leave. I said her name again. It was not a plea this time. It was an indictment. A pause. The pause lasted the length of one tick of the hallway clock. Then she kept walking. The door closed with a slow patience that felt crueler than a slam. I do not know how long I sat after that. When I finally dragged myself to the bathroom, the mirror showed a stranger. A thin girl with a split lip and a bruise rising purple under the skin. I held the edge of the sink and let the water run until it steamed. I washed my face. I washed my hands. I washed until my skin ached from the heat. The towel left lint on my cheek like ash. Back in my room I tried the bed. Lying down hurt more than standing, so I stayed on the floor, back against the frame. I pressed my palm to the loose board where my journals lived and counted my breaths. Now I told myself, put it down. Make a record before the night smears the edges. I slid the board aside, took my notebook and wrote. The words came slow at first, then faster. When the pain surged, I stopped, then started again like someone learning to wade across a river with a broken foot. The page filled with small, tight letters, my hand cramped into a claw. When I finished, I signed my name like a witness. I put the date and the time. I slid the journal back under the floor and pressed the board flat. In the morning, I could not stand upright without the room going gray at the edges. I pulled on a dress, moved the collar high to hide what I could, and stepped into the hall. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. It should have smelled like comfort. Did not. My mother stood at the stove. The radio hummed a cheerful tune that did not belong in our house. Daniel sat at the table with his back to me. Head bent over the sports section as if he had earned the right to read about victory. My chair was empty, my bowl clean, my spoon lined up straight. Routine can be a kind of menace. I sat without speaking. My hands would not stop shaking long enough to lift the cup. My mother noticed, I think. She did not ask. She cracked an egg into a pan and watched it set, white going opaque, yolk holding. I wanted her to say my name. She did not. At school the world narrowed to the rectangle of my desk. Kept my gaze low. When the teacher called on me, my voice broke on the first word and I coughed to hide it. The room swam when I stood for the pledge. By lunchtime I was cold despite the radiator's hiss. In the afternoon the pain bent me double and I asked to go to the nurse. Her room smelled like antiseptic and peppermint. She pressed her fingers lightly to the bruise on my cheekbone, eyes careful. You fall, Maggie. Yes. Where? Hallway rug. Did you hit your head? I do not remember. She watched me longer than the questions required. Then she wrote a note for home and tucked it into a small envelope with the school crest printed in blue. Give this to your mother. He nodded. I did not. On the walk home I cut through the side yard of the Johnsons and stood behind their hedge until the school bus passed, until the street went quiet. My legs trembled and I lowered myself to the dirt and breathed through the wave until it passed. A robin hopped in the grass 2 feet away, head tilted, as if weighing whether I was a danger. I was not a danger to anything. I reached our porch after 4. The front door stood open to let out the smell of bleach. My mother was on her knees scrubbing the entry floor with a steel wool pad. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, skin gone red from the solution. She looked up when my shadow crossed the threshold. Her eyes flicked to the envelope in my hand. I had forgotten I was still holding it. What is that? Note. From whom? A nurse. She held out a wet hand. I stepped forward and gave it to her. She did not read it. She did not tear it up. She walked to the side table, opened the drawer, and placed the envelope inside as if returning a spoon to its slot. Then she shut the drawer and went back to scrubbing. I watched her work. Her rhythm was measured and even, circles overlapping, the kind of care she rarely used on people. I waited for a question that did not come. After a long while I went to my room. That night I tried to plan. The word plan is too large for what I did. I made a list. Tell a teacher. Tell Mrs. Carter next door. Write to Aunt Louise. Run. Each line blurred as soon as I wrote it. Fear crossed them out in my head even before my pencil could. I put the notebook away and curled on the rug with a pillow under my ribs to soften the pressure where it hurt most. What woke me was the sound of the drawer in the front hall sliding open. It was a sound I knew the way you know your own name. I sat up and held my breath. The boards in the hallway carried steps toward the living room. My door was only half closed. I moved to it on my knees and pressed my eye to the gap. My mother stood by the entry table with the envelope in her hand. She did not move to open it. She turned it over, then over again, as if the paper might confess its contents without the bother of tearing the seal. The clock ticked. She set the envelope back inside the drawer, closed it softly, and crossed to the sofa. Then she did something I had never seen her do. She took the house phone from its cradle and dialed. Counted the clicks. 7 numbers. She cupped the receiver as if it might see her, as if the phone itself could betray her secret. Her voice was lower than usual, a rasp from a throat that did not speak enough. Do not worry, she said. I took care of it. No one will come asking. She paused. She listened. Then she said it, the sentence that fractured something so cleanly inside me that I felt the break as a kind of relief. I saw everything. Silence on the other end. Then my mother again, softer, the words like dust settling. She will keep quiet. She cradled the receiver, set it down, and folded both hands in her lap. For a long time she sat without moving. The lamp drew a small circle around her that the rest of the room refused to enter. When she finally rose, she went to the drawer and pushed it closed with the gentlest touch, as if she did not want the wood to feel the weight of what she had hidden there. I crawled back from the door and lay flat on the floor, cheek against the cool boards. The wood smelled faintly of lemon oil and winter shoes. I looked up into the dark and thought of the robin in the yard, the way it had judged me harmless. I had been harmless my whole life. It had kept me alive. Had cost me everything. The house settled. Pipes ticked. In the front room the clock took up its patient labor again. And there, with my body hurting and my voice no good to me, I reached a place so far below the life I had known that I could not imagine a way back. It was quiet there. There was no light. There were only facts. My mother had seen. She had heard. She had chosen. Low points do not announce themselves. They do not draw a line on the wall and say here. This is where you bottom out. You recognize them only because you stop falling. On the second breath after that thought, something scraped against the baseboard near my hand. I turned my head and saw, tucked into the shadow where the floor met the wall, a folded slip of paper I did not recognize. Perhaps it had been pushed there by the brush when my mother cleaned. Perhaps the house itself had coughed it up, tired of holding so much. I reached and pulled it free. It was a letter on school stationery. The crest printed in blue. The date in the corner was last spring. My teacher's name at the bottom. The words were careful, the way adults write when they are trying to say a dangerous thing politely. Concerns about changes in Maggie's demeanor. Frequent fatigue. Startled responses in class. Recommendation for a meeting to discuss her well-being. The last line did not sound like my teacher at all. It sounded like the way the nurse had looked at me. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. There was a second page. A note in my mother's tidy hand. Thank you for your concern. Maggie is fine. The paper trembled. I realized it was because my hands were shaking so hard the lines blurred and the crest wavered. I pressed the pages to the floor to still them and closed my eyes. She had known long before the doorway. She had been told. She had written back. Something like cold fire moved through me from sternum to spine, an opposite of paralysis. I had wanted proof for years without admitting it. Now the proof sat in my hands, soft and thin and impossible to argue with. My breath steadied. Not because the pain eased, but because the floor under me finally felt like something I could use. I folded the letter and slid it under the loose board with my journals. The wood clicked soft against my palm. Then I said my mother's name out loud. Not a plea. Not an indictment. Promise. When you live your whole life in silence, your first whisper of rebellion feels like thunder. After I found that letter, proof that my mother had known, proof that she had been warned, proof that she had chosen stillness instead of action, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, yes. My body still ached, my soul still bled. But the despair that had weighed me down like an anchor began to harden into something else. Resolve. I was still only a child then, 15 years old, but I realized the truth. Silence was not weakness, it was a weapon. My mother had wielded it all my life, and it had kept Daniel's cruelty hidden. But if silence could be a weapon, then so could words. The right words. The truth. The thought frightened me at first. Speaking had always felt dangerous. But once the idea lodged in me, it wouldn't let go. It was like a seed dropped into soil after a fire. Fragile, yet stubborn, determined to push up through ash and ruin. Began to plan. First, my plans were small, childish. I imagined standing up in the middle of church and shouting what Daniel had done, daring the congregation to look at me the way they had when my father used to parade us for our perfect family image. I imagined grabbing my mother's wrist at the supper table, forcing her to look me in the eye, and demanding she tell the truth. But each time I played the scenes out in my head, fear drowned them. I was 17. Who would believe me? The teacher who had already written letters. The nurse who had already sent notes. The town that already whispered that the Lawsons were respectable. No, I needed to be smarter. I started to watch my mother more closely. Her silences, her small gestures. I noticed the way she tightened her jaw whenever Daniel entered the room, the way her hand trembled slightly when she handed him a plate. For years I had thought she was stone, untouchable. But now I saw the cracks in her armor. She was not invincible. She was guilty, and guilt, I realized, could be used. I wrote everything down. Not just the things Daniel did, but the moments my mother witnessed. I dated each entry, described where she stood, what she said or didn't say. I made a record that grew heavier each week, tucked beneath the floorboard with the school letter and my earlier journals. It became my secret arsenal. By the time I turned 16, I had filled 3 notebooks. My handwriting had changed from the small, cramped script of a frightened child to the steady lines of a girl who knew what she was building. Each word was a nail. Each date a hammer strike. I was building a coffin for their lies. But I knew timing mattered. Speaking too soon would only bury me deeper. I had to wait until I had power. That meant surviving. Surviving Daniel meant learning his rhythms. I memorized the times of day he prowled, the signs in his face before he lashed out. I learned how to disappear into corners, how to keep my footsteps light, how to make myself invisible the way my mother had. But for me, invisibility wasn't surrender. It was strategy. By 17 I had grown taller, stronger. The bruises didn't last as long. The pain didn't bend me the way it once had. But the silence still screamed at me. My mother's silence, especially. There were nights when I would stand outside her bedroom door, journal in hand, ready to fling it onto her bed and force her to read every page. But then I'd hear her soft humming, the same tune she always carried like a shield, and I'd stop. Not yet. Not like this. No, I thought. I won't beg her to speak. I'll make her speak. The question was how. The answer came the summer I turned 18. It was at church. Daniel sat smugly in the front pew, already working at the mill like our father, already praised as a young man of promise. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded neatly, her face the picture of piety. And me, I sat in the back, the notebooks burned into my memory. That day, Father Wallace preached about truth, about how lies rot a community from within, about how silence too can be sin. I stared at my mother. For the first time she looked at me, truly looked, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. Fear. Recognition. And that's when the plan crystallized. If my mother would not speak in private, I would force her to speak in public. I would hold her silence up to the light where everyone could see it. I would corner her in a place where silence was impossible. The church. The very place where we had been paraded as a perfect family. The very place where appearances mattered most. From that day on, my plan sharpened. I began gathering more than journals. I slipped into the school office one afternoon and copied records of the nurses' notes. I found old report cards with teachers' comments about my fatigue and withdrawal. I wrote down names of neighbors who had seen bruises, who had asked questions however small. I wasn't just building a story. I was building evidence. By the time I left for a small community college 2 towns over, I carried the notebooks with me, hidden at the bottom of a trunk. I studied hard, worked part-time, and for the first time in my life, I felt air in my lungs that didn't taste like silence. But every trip back home, every glance at my mother's face across the supper table, reminded me of my vow. The years passed. Daniel married, had children of his own. My mother aged, her hair turning silver, her hands more brittle, but her silence never cracked. Not once. Until I made it. I returned to Willow Bend at 45. By then I had a career, a home, a voice I had learned to sharpen in classrooms and on paper. I wasn't the trembling girl on the floor anymore. I was steel, shaped by years of fire. And I knew exactly what I was going to do. I asked my mother to meet me at church one Sunday after service. She agreed, her face pale but composed. I could see in her eyes that she knew the silence had grown too heavy to carry forever. What she didn't know was that I had prepared everything. The journals. The letters. Witnesses who were ready to confirm what they'd seen. Even the pastor who thought I was coming to speak about forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't my aim. The truth was. And when I stood at that pulpit, the same pulpit where Daniel had smirked as a boy, the same pews where my mother had sat with folded hands, I was ready. Ready to tear the silence wide open. Ready to make her speak. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? When I walked into Willow Bend's church that Sunday morning, 40 years after the day my mother stood in the doorway and did nothing, the smell hit me first. The lemon polish. The lilies at the altar. The faint burn of candles left too long. Time had shifted everything else. The faces, the choir robes, even the hymn numbers on the wall. But that smell had not changed. It was the same smell that clung to my skin the day I begged for help, and my mother's silence answered louder than words. I was no longer 15. I was 45. My hair was streaked with gray, my voice sharpened by years of using it, my body scarred but unbowed. And in my bag I carried the weight of decades, journals, letters, copies of reports, proof that silence had been a choice, not ignorance. I had come to make her speak. The congregation rustled into pews. Some recognized me. Maggie Lawson, the girl who had got out, the woman who taught literature at the college 2 towns over. They smiled politely, nodding as if I were just another visitor returning home. None of them knew what I carried. Daniel was there. Older, broader, his hair thinning at the crown. He sat 3 pews from the front with his wife and 2 children. His posture smug, as if the town still belonged to him. My mother sat beside him, her frame smaller now, shoulders stooped, hands folded the same way they always had been. Her eyes flicked to me once, quickly, then away. The service passed in a blur. Hymns I mouthed without singing, prayers I let wash over me. My heart thudded not with fear but with a steady, pulsing purpose. When the pastor began to close, I rose. "Pastor," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Before we end, may I speak?" A murmur rippled through the pews. The pastor, startled, nodded. "Of course, Sister Lawson." I walked to the front, every step echoing. I didn't stop at the lectern. I walked straight to the pulpit, set my bag on the wood, and faced the people who had watched my family parade here for decades. "I was 15 years old," I began, "the day my brother broke me in this town." The words fell heavy, shocking. The congregation stiffened. Few gasped. Daniel shifted in his seat, his face tightening. My mother froze, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. "And my mother," I said, my eyes locking on hers, "stood in the doorway and did nothing." Silence. Pure electric silence. The kind that vibrates in the bones. I pulled the first journal from my bag, its cover worn, the pages yellowed. For decades I wrote it down. Every bruise. Every silence. Every time she turned her head. I opened to a page, read aloud the words of a 15-year-old girl. She saw. She saw. Whispers erupted. A woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand to her mouth. The pastor's face paled. I pulled out the school nurse's note, unfolded it carefully. This was written when I was 15. The nurse was worried. She wrote my mother. And my mother replied. I held up the 2nd page, my mother's neat handwriting visible. "She is fine." A sharp cry rang out, my mother's. Her first sound in decades about that truth. Her hand trembled as if she could will the paper from my hand by sheer force. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Daniel. "You," I said, my voice steady. "You sat in this church, praised as a son of promise, while I sat in silence. You grew fat on respectability while I bled in shadows. You thought silence would save you." His face darkened. "Stop this," he muttered. His wife looked at him, confusion dawning. His children stared wide-eyed. "No," I said firmly. "Not this time. This time you will hear me." I spread the letters, the journals, the reports across the pulpit. Pages fluttered like wings, filling the space with the sound of release. For decades, this town praised us as respectable. But respect built on silence is rot. And today I will not carry it anymore. The whispers grew louder, scandal rippling like a storm. Some tried to shush, others leaned forward hungry for more. But I wasn't speaking for them. I was speaking for me. Then I turned back to my mother. She was shaking, her lips pressed thin, her eyes darting to the door like a trapped animal. "Say it," I told her. My voice was calm but unrelenting. "Say what you saw." She shook her head. "You stood in the doorway," I pressed. "You watched." "Say it." Her breath came fast, shallow. "Maggie," she whispered, her voice breaking like porcelain dropped on tile. The congregation leaned in. They had never heard Helen Lawson falter. "Say it," thundered. For once in your life, speak. Her hands flew to her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and sudden, as if released from a dam that had held them for 40 years. And then, in a cracked voice that carried through the sanctuary, she said the words I had waited my whole life to hear. I saw. God forgive me, I saw. Gasps echoed. The weight of her confession filled the church like smoke. Daniel leapt to his feet. She's lying, he shouted, but the words rang hollow against his mother's sobs. His wife pulled their children close, her face stricken. I stood tall, my voice steady. No. The lies are over. The silence is over. She has spoken. And now everyone knows. I gathered the pages, the letters, the journals. The proof was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, alive in every ear that had heard. For the first time in my life I felt light. Not healed. No, healing would be its own long road, but unchained. I looked at my mother one last time. Her shoulders shook with sobs. Her silence shattered into pieces she could never gather again. I turned to the congregation. Silence protects the guilty. Truth protects the living. Let that be what you remember today. Then I walked out. The sky outside was gray, heavy with the threat of rain. But to me it felt like the first breath of freedom. For decades, silence had been my prison. But in that moment, standing on the church steps with the whole town buzzing behind me, I knew I had broken its walls. My mother had spoken. And in making her speak, I had finally freed myself. They say silence is golden. But silence can also be a weapon, one that protects the guilty and buries the innocent. For 40 years my mother chose it. And for 40 years it nearly destroyed me. But the day she finally spoke, the chains broke. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her love. I only needed her truth. And when she said those 3 words, I saw everything. The silence that haunted me died right there on that church floor. If this story moved you, if you believe every hidden truth deserves to be heard, then join me here. Subscribe to the channel, share these stories, and help make sure no voice is ever silenced again.